Hi everyone, this is Sarah O'Keefe. Welcome to our State of Structure 2011 webcast. A couple of housekeeping notes to get us off the ground. Everybody except for me is muted. You can use the questions area in the webcast interface to ask your questions. You may want to go ahead and find that as we're going along. I will try to answer questions that are related as we go through the material. We also have some time at the end left over for Q&A. We are recording the presentation, but the attendees will not appear in the recording, so your audio will not be there. In fact, you will not have audio, and I may repeat the question, but I'm not going to identify where it came from. So welcome aboard, and let's see what we can do here. For those of you that don't know me, there's a pretty picture of exactly what I am wearing at this very moment. I run a company called Scriptorium Publishing. We're based in North Carolina, and the survey that we're doing today is actually a repeat of something we did in 2009. So we put up a web survey on SurveyMonkey.com, opened it up in January and February of 2011, and recruited participants through direct email to our mailing lists and also Twitter blog posts and general word of mouth. We did ask other people to post in their blogs and let people know about the survey we were doing. We had about 200. About 265 started it, about 190 completed it, which means they got all the way through the demographic data at the end. That does imply that we have partial data for more than 200 people, but it's a little tricky, as you probably know if you've done web surveys. And it's also worth noting that this survey is basically identical to what we did in 2009. I do have some comparison data, but we have to be very, very careful because we did not have a lot of overlap as far as we know between the people that filled out the survey in 2009 and the people that filled it out in 2011. So we can't really directly compare them, although we have done so in a few cases, but you really do have to take that with a grain of salt. So in our survey, and this was in fact the first thing that people would see when they went into the survey, we defined structured authoring as a publishing workflow that lets you define and automatically enforce consistent organization. We also mentioned that implementations are generally based on XML, on extensible markup languages. So that was where we started from. And then we went in and asked the burning first question, have you implemented structured authoring or do you plan to do so? And what I'd like to do is open up a poll for you all and see what your prediction is here. What percentage of respondents do you think said that they already either have implemented structured authoring, or sorry, what percentage of respondents do you think said we have implemented structured authoring? We already have structure in response to this question. So you can kind of take your best guess here and see what they came up with. But to clarify, this would be the people who said we have implemented, not the people who said we plan to do so, although we do have that answer as well. I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then I'll show you what the responses actually were, first from you and then from the actual survey. Okay, so I'm up to 89% here, so I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And you will see that the general consensus here is somewhere between 20 and 40%. Is sort of where the bell curve lies. A few people think higher. A good number think lower. So the actual answer from the 200 and some odd people that filled out our survey as to have you implemented structured authoring was 42%. A good additional number said we're working on it, we're going to begin this year, we're planning on it, we're going to do it eventually. About 10% said we're undecided, and about 14% said we are not going to implement ever. But 42% said we have structure. Now, I would not take this to mean that 42% of TechCom is using structured authoring. I would take this to mean that 42% of the people that filled out our survey are in structure, and that's not that surprising given who we contacted. Our customer and database is clearly going to be skewed towards structured authoring. We did get some interesting comparison data out of this, though, because then what we did was we looked at the question of how does this compare to 2009. In 2009, we got 29% that said that they had implemented. So we had a jump of was about 11, 12, 13% from 2009 to 2011. And our undecided number dropped a whole bunch, from 21% down to 10%. So I thought that was kind of interesting. There's some other things that we could maybe extrapolate from this, but generally we're getting a higher number, and there seem to be fewer undecideds. It seems that people have pretty much figured out whether or not they need structure, and they are ready to move forward with that, or not, as the case may be. So the next question that we asked that we thought was important was, why did you choose structured authoring? And we gave people 7 choices, which included compliance and personalization, but I will give it away and tell you that those 2 were, in fact, the bottom 2 options that people reported. So I'm going to give you another poll here and ask you if you will choose what you think the single most important reason was that people gave for moving to structure. These were the 5 choices. They were written out. For example, localization cost was a little bit lengthier. It said something about reducing the cost of localization or something like that. But these were basically the 5 plus the 2 other choices that we gave them. Now, in the poll, or sorry, in the survey, we actually had people do forced ranking. So we forced them to rank these things from 1 to 7, which made some people a little bit cranky. But that was in fact the way we handled it, because we really wanted to see what was driving this. You know, all of these factors are interesting, but which one is the most important? Which one is the most critical one that people had? All right, so let's take a look here at what you think. And it looks as though you think that reuse would be the winner, followed by localization, and then as a distant third and fourth, we would have cost of effort and consistency. And you would be not so much correct, although I think content reuse was in fact the winner, but beyond that, it got a little interesting. What we actually found, now the shorter bars here mean that things are more important. So when the smaller the bar is, the more important that item is. And the other thing you should know here is that these are past, current, and future implementers. So the people who said, yes, we have structure, get green bars, the bar on the top. The people who said, we are working on it right now, get that ugly pink-colored thing. And the people who say, we are going to implement in the future, get that light blue. So what we got here was that, in fact, past, present, and future are actually pretty consistent in terms of the differences of where it's important, where it's not important. Compliance was clearly the loser, followed, not so far behind by personalization. One interesting thing we noticed here was that if you look at localization was the only one where we saw a clear trend that the more important it was, the shorter the bar was, the more likely they were to have implemented earlier. So in other words, the past implementers had more important localization. The top 3, though, were reuse, which I think you all got right. I think 42% of you said reuse, which was pretty much it. And then consistency, and then cost and effort. Those were the top 3. Localization was not one of the top 3. And the interesting thing there was that, first of all, localization tended to be among the people who have already implemented. But localization, we were surprised. It was not as high as you might think it is. I think there's a good percentage of people out there that simply don't have localization requirements. And we did see a split where localization tended to be either very important or not very important at all. There weren't a whole lot of people that said localization cost is kind of important. Now, we did find that inside the people that reported that they chose DITA, which I'll get to in a minute, those people were much more likely to say that localization was a concern. So the average for localization for past implementers was 3.9, which is kind of an intermediate sort of number. The average score for past implementers that chose DITA was 3.5, which is a good bit more important. And the average score for localization for the people who chose a custom structure was 4.67. So it was much, much higher, which means less important, for the people that chose custom structure. I think this means that if you need localization, those people tend to choose DITA, and the people who aren't concerned about localization tend to pick custom. I don't know whether this is an artifact of older implementations where DITA was not yet available. Our data is not good enough to tell us that. We just don't have enough granularity in there. And the survey was already quite long, so we really didn't want to go any longer. So speaking of DITA, we asked about this. We said, okay, what structure did you choose? And again, we have past, present, and future here. And the clear and overwhelming winner by a majority, almost a veto-proof majority, so about 60% have chosen, are choosing, or are planning to choose DITA. DocBook was pretty consistent, around 5%. Custom kind of jumped around 38, 25, 33, and then all others, this included the ATA spec, S1000D, and a couple of other things. I think if you add together custom and all others, you get a pretty consistent number. So people are, I think, generally the loss over on custom becomes a gain of the others in general. We're not sure what's going on here. I mean, obviously DITA is important. I think it's safe to say that at this point it's considered the standard in TechCom, and it's hard to justify doing something else. So people sort of go with this. It also looks as though, you know, custom is kind of dropping off. It made a little comeback there for the future people, but I wonder if the future, we tend to look at the future implementer data as being not as reliable as past and current because they haven't made the decisions yet. They're telling us what they're planning to do, but it could still change. So then we said, okay, tell us, those of you who decided that not to go to structure, why did you decide not to go to structure? Now, in this poll, I have given you the option of checking multiple items. And I'm looking here for sort of an idea of what do you think would be the answer that people would give when we ask them, do you need structure? Why do you need structure? Or sorry, do you not need structure? Why have you chosen not to go to structure? So this is the group that said, no, we are not going to structure. That was about 14% of the overall sample. And let's see what they gave us. You will not be graded on these responses. I'm kind of looking to see whether the people that are on this call are actually, you know, in the same ballpark as the people that were filling out the survey, and if you can kind of predict what they might have said. So in this case, you've got about 5 more seconds, and I'm going to close this poll. In this case, what we got, or sorry, what you got is cost and time as the so-called winner. Staff will not adjust behind that, and then everything else kind of just goes away. And that actually tracks, with the exception of the staff will not adjust, that actually tracks pretty well with what we found. Cost and time was the clear winner or loser, as you might say, and then about 30 to 35% gave the other the other 3 reasons: not localized, not reused, staff will not adjust, and we had a good number of people that said other. And I've got some samples of what they said when we asked them, well, you know, tell us more. But clearly cost and time was an obstacle. Now, this makes me wonder whether there are additional people that might go to structure if there were a cheaper way of doing it. They are looking at this and saying the value is not there, it's too much money. And I'm not sure I disagree with that. I don't know these situations exactly. But we got a lot of comments about lack of value. A single author environment, it just doesn't make sense for me to do this. The payoff isn't there. The benefits aren't there. A lot of people said what we have works and we don't need structure. No compelling benefits, too much overhead. So there was a lack of value for some people. There were some others, though, and these I think were less valid. Fear of change. You know, this is too much change. We can't handle it in our organization. Our organization can't handle this. I like not even thinking inside the box. These are all direct quotes. Anytime you see the quotes, these are direct quotes taken from the comments of the survey. Not sure how it will impact us. People were concerned. I mean, we got a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety and a lot of not very happy about the prospect of having to go to structure. So those were kind of the major things that we got from that 14% that said, no, we are not doing structure. Now, the next question we asked had to do with achieving the goals that were identified. So the question we asked at the end of the section that was filled out by the people who said, yes, we have done structure and we have implemented, we said, okay, well, did you achieve your goals? And so we gave them the 7 items that we had identified and said, did you achieve this thing? And these are pretty big bars. Compliance, not so many, but very few people had compliance as an issue. But, 25%, 30% or so got personalization, which was not a priority. And then we kind of go up from there, 35% for information exchange, 50% got reduced localization costs, 60% got reduced cost and effort of development, 80-ish% got increased reuse, and 82% or so got consistency. So there were a lot of things going on here, but overall it looks to me as though the top 3 things that were identified, reduced cost and effort, increased reuse, and consistency, tracked with really high achievement numbers. Now, the cost number, they did not bring that down, or 60% said it came down, which implies that 40% did not check that box, but 80% did report consistency and reuse would imply reduced costs perhaps, and that's something we need to look at when we get into some of the details. A couple of questions here. Let me tackle these because they're related to a couple of the slides. So this is, I think, back to the people who did not implement. Those who did implement were not so strongly motivated by localization. Localization was the 4th most important thing reported by the general implementer population, but it was more important for those people who mentioned DITA. So the people who said, we went to DITA, that was different. For objections in terms of not doing this, do we have trends by industry? We do not. Our demographics are not good enough to do that, unfortunately. We do have some demographics, but not very many, and we did cross-section them and look at some of this stuff, but we were not able to pull out any useful information by industry. So goals, generally it looks as though the goals were achieved. And of course, people were allowed to check multiple ones, so you might have gotten consistency but not information exchange or something like that. We asked about other goals, other things that you might have accomplished, and these are all things that people mentioned. Automated daily publishing, automated builds, there were a number of people that mentioned that. Reduction of total content, which is perhaps not exactly the same thing as increased reuse, but this is less redundancy. A step towards content and presentation being separated, shorter time to provide more languages, easier workflow, rebranding variants, and perhaps 24 other comments that were in this sort of general area, these types of things. So people came up with lots of goals that they accomplished that didn't fall neatly into our category of 7 or so. So then we asked about implementation cost. Past, present, and future implementers, how much did it cost to actually do the implementation? The number 1 answer here was, I don't know. And, something like 50%, 40 to 50% said, I don't know. Then we got a lot that said less than 25,000. We divided it out, less than 25,000, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 50, and more than $250,000. So that's what we got. I don't see a whole lot here to work with. I don't see any sort of pattern. I just see some numbers that are kind of all over the place. We did take a shot at coming up with an average cost of implementation from this. So what we did was we took these numbers, and this is admittedly arbitrary, so take it with a very large grain of salt. We took the numbers for past implementers and said, okay, if they said $25,000 or less, then that is $12.5 thousand. So we took the midpoint. 25 to 50 is 37.5, etc. For the greater than $250,000, we made it $350,000. That is a judgment. You can manipulate the data and get a different number. And then we took the weighted average. So we took each responder, multiplied it by the average that we have calculated, and then kind of looked at that to see what we came up with. So the result is that DITA is in fact free but not cheap, or structure is in fact perhaps free but not cheap. In 2009, our result for DITA implementation cost using this methodology I've just explained was $106,000 approximately. In 2011, it was $124,500. The 2011 non-DITA number, so the people who have implemented who said they're not using DITA, so we exclude the DITA people, is $69,000. So if you average those two, and of course you have to weight it because there were more DITA people than not DITA people, you will get something around about $100,000, a little bit less. So that is kind of the order of magnitude we're dealing with. I would not advise you to go out and ask for $124,000 and $124,500. These were so rough. These averages are so rough. But, you know, somewhere around $100,000 appears to be approximately the correct number in general. The problem with this is we had a lot of people that said zero, you know, nothing. We bought some tools and we did it ourselves. It didn't cost us anything. We also don't have a methodology for asking what this number meant. We didn't say you have to include the cost of your in-house people. We just said, what did it cost? Give us a number. And again, the most common number we got was, I don't know. So I would take this with a serious, serious grain of salt. Again, I'm not picking on our numbers. These numbers are the best we have. They're not great, and I want you to understand what the limitations are, but this is what we have, and this is the best we've been able to do to get. So, given this number of $124,500, and I know a bunch of you right now are like fanning yourselves going, oh no, I'll never get that. Rampant speculation here. I believe that there are additional CMSs being rolled out, and that would explain some of the increase. If you have a CMS as a content management system as part of your implementation, I think that will increase the cost. I think that perhaps people are getting a little more realistic about costs, that they are saying, okay, you know, I'm going to need software, I'm going to need training, I'm going to need this and that, and so their numbers are getting a little higher because they are being a little more realistic, the process is better understood. And then, as reuse is so important, I think that perhaps more people are thinking about content management systems. But I do have some information about how many did content management, and it's not so many. We'll get to that one. So this is my speculation. My speculation is that people are just getting a little bit more realistic. We have a better idea of what it really takes, and therefore the numbers went up, you know, about 20%. I don't think that implementation has gotten 20% more complex necessarily. Now, having said that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what affects DITA cost. And this is not out of survey data. This is out of our work and anecdotally what we're seeing in terms of what costs money. So, things that make DITA cost of implementation go up are specialization. If you customize the DITA structure and you add specialized elements, that will increase the cost of implementation because it makes your content model more complex. Complex output requirements, especially PDF, will make your costs go up. So if you want your PDF to look a certain way, and it has to be exactly that way or else, and that certain way is interesting, unusual, and complex, then your cost of implementation will go up because the cost of actually designing the PDF output is going to be significant. Legacy documentation conversion is a huge cost, and that was mentioned as a surprise by a lot of people later on. Content management systems, if you're going to do them, I think you're going to see costs there. And the other thing I would mention is a large number of contributors. You know, if you have 50 people contributing content, then you need 50 copies of the authoring tool probably, and that would clearly be more expensive than 2 people, you know, in a corner somewhere. So these are kind of the things that we see that add to cost, which I think makes sense. And from that, we can draw some conclusions about that $125,000. One thing we are still working on is cross-sectioning the cost information against the size of the groups doing the implementation. I don't have that data yet. It's in the survey, and we'll be able to pull it out, but we don't have it yet. We asked about authoring tools. So we actually asked a couple of different questions here. For the people who had implemented, we said, what tools did you consider, and what tool did you select? For present, what tools did you consider? What tools are you going to select? And we asked the future people what they were considering. So here I've broken out only the past implementers and what they actually chose, and the present implementers and what they actually chose. And what we find here is that the highest market share goes to Structured FrameMaker by, a good bit. Then you'll see Oxygen in second place, XMetal in third place, and then there's a pretty good drop-off down to Arbortext, Vanilla Text Editors, XML Mind, and then Flare and AuthorIt both showed up in our survey. It is my opinion that Flare and AuthorIt, Flare will store XHTML content, which is technically XML, so technically it saves XML. It is, however, not a structured authoring tool in the sense that you can't throw an XML, DTD, or schema at it and say validate against this. AuthorIt has its own structured authoring approach, which is actually not bound exactly to XML, and it did show up in the survey at about 5%. So that is what we got, but there's pretty clearly a big three: Structured FrameMaker, Oxygen, and XMetal, and then there's sort of all the rest of them. We asked about DITA authoring specifically. So we actually said, what about DITA if you're in DITA? And when we did that, we got sort of a more pronounced big three. Those three got sort of co-equal. You don't see FrameMaker way out in front anymore. So Oxygen and XMetal did very, very well in that space, and then the rest of them are kind of there. I'm a little cranky about the various present implementers who said we're using Flare as a DITA authoring tool, because even the Flare marketing people will not tell you that Flare is a DITA authoring tool. So just for the record, that is silly. A couple of interesting comments here. One that says, I'm guessing Flare is FrameMaker is most popular because most of the other editors are seen as roughly equal in functionality. That seems reasonable. And I'm tempted to out this person, but I won't. The second comment that's here is regarding the text editors. What asylums are the folks who are using the text editors in? So, okay then, I'll leave that one alone. But there they are. I would argue that the text editor, programming text editor people are a little more sane than the people that are using non-structured authoring tools and claiming it's structured authoring, but we'll just leave that alone. So that was what we got. There's clearly a big three, and then some other stuff kind of bringing up the rear. We asked about content management systems. Now, this was a new question. We did not ask this in 2009. It was the only question we added to the survey because it was just, we didn't want it to get any longer. It's very long already. And for those of you that did fill it out, we really appreciate it. Okay, so what CMS do you or will you use, we said. And across the board, about 33 to 34% said do not use. Other responses we got were, and there they are, a little bit of everything. These are all ones that got at least sort of 2 or 3 votes. There were many, many more that got 1 or 2 votes. I mean, we had so many content management system responses, it was just absolutely ridiculous. By far, the most common response was do not use. Nobody else got more than maybe 10% overall. And it was so fragmented, and at that point, the number of responses we're getting are quite small, and we just can't slice it or dice it out much further because we'll just get in trouble because at that point, you have 2 people responding to the survey who could really throw the data just in that one little place. So lots and lots of stuff going on here, lots and lots of fragmentation. It's pretty clear to me that there's an opportunity here for somebody to do it right and pick up some market share, but nobody has really gone into that yet and gone in that direction. We did try to break this down and ask about DITA CMS. So specifically, if you are a DITA user, we ask the same question, we can filter that data. So if you're a DITA user and you were in the past, you've already implemented, 50% said we don't have a CMS. There were a whole pile of other responses, but Astoria, Vassant, Ixiosoft, and Xdocs were the leaders, if you want to call it that. A change of 1 vote one way or another would change these numbers. Current implementers, 36% said no CMS, and the leaders there were Astoria, SharePoint, and TriSoft. So that's kind of where we are with that. So that's what we got. Again, a very fragmented market, and I'm just really, really reluctant to draw any conclusions whatsoever about the CMS field, except to tell you that lots of people are not using CMSs. Lots. We also got a decent number of votes for things like Subversion, a clear case, other source control systems, but those were small numbers, very small numbers. So there's an interesting comment here that came in, not even close, and this was back on the tools. XMetal does not do DITA map spell check. Oxygen costs a third of FrameMaker and XMetal. I've used all three, and Oxygen is far superior, says somebody who is not me. I like Oxygen a lot. I think Oxygen is a wonderful tool. I will say that our experience is that the developers, the people who are doing DITA development work, XSL configuration, that kind of thing, love Oxygen so much. The plain vanilla authors tend to not love it quite as much as those of us who are developers, although I think Oxygen's made a lot of progress in that area, and obviously the price point is compelling. So I think that is a reasonable approach to take. I like Oxygen a whole bunch, but I've used the other two as well, and they're fine. Okay, we asked about change management. Now, this one's a little tricky, and I ran out of space to label this. This is an issue of my graphical skills or lack thereof. You have two bars here for each of these. So we asked, during implementation, did you see the following? And one answer was interest and excitement about the new tools. And then we had a lot, some, and none as the three choices for that response. Did you see a lot of concerns about tools and process, concerns about productivity, hostility, or turnover? So basically, the first one is a positive change. People were interested, excited, they wanted to change. The other four are all negative. And then the two bars are the past implementers and the current implementers. So what we're seeing is, on the interest, there is rising interest and excitement in new tools, which is good. But you'll notice that also that tools and process went way up from sort of, 20%, 45, 15, or something like that to something like, 70% saying they're very concerned about tools and processes. The other bars didn't move around so much. There was a little bit of turnover concern rising, but generally they kind of stayed the same, except that we did see a good bit of difference on these first two and maybe three. We could argue that the third one's kind of headed up there if you add together the a lot and the sum. So what this looks like to me is increasing concern about change and perhaps increased change resistance. What we were trying to measure here was change resistance. We think that perhaps the early adopters, the people who think this new stuff is cool, have already adopted, and the people who are now adopting are the middle to late adopters, and they are more change averse, and they are more concerned about tools and process. But I don't have a good feel for exactly what's going on here, and of course the people answering our survey are telling us what they saw in their organization. So this is some sort of interesting hearsay. So that's kind of what we have here. And there's a question here about whether I can correlate use of a CMS in the past adopters with those who identified content reuse as a successful goal. I have not done that yet, but it's a good idea, and we will do it. So we will get that into the final report because that is definitely something that we should do. I will say that the 80% that said they got change reuse is clearly more than the 60 or 70% that said they had some sort of a CMS. Actually, I don't think it was that high. It was about 50%. So, okay, so increased change issues. There's definitely some concern here. And, yeah, somebody else is mentioning lack of resources and compliance requirements. We did get lack of resources. That was a serious, serious concern that people had. Compliance was not a big issue. We looked for compliance, and hardly anybody said that compliance was important, something like 10% of our sample. Now, that doesn't mean that compliance is unimportant. It just means it was unimportant to those 200 and some odd people that filled this out. We asked, and this is actually my favorite part of the session, we asked the question, what was the biggest mistake you made in implementing? And these are all direct quotes that we got. Again, the same thing happened 2 years ago. We got a ton of questions or answers that pretty much boiled down to we didn't plan. You know, the scope, the planning, lack of testing, implementing in a live production environment. My personal favorite there, involving the marketing department. That person went on to say that marketing was obstructionist and difficult, and then actually didn't end up using the tools that they insisted on picking. So that was, you know, funny in kind of a sad way because I wasn't involved. All of these comments are really planning and project management, and that was the same thing we saw 3 years ago. Planning and project management were a problem. Another one we saw a lot of complaints about was document conversion. Now, one person said we tried to use inexperienced offshore labor and that was bad. Another person said we didn't use a vendor and that was bad. Too little time for conversion, too little consistency, all those kinds of things, and those all tied into bad conversion. The other thing that we saw in this area, conversion and project complexity, and there were numerous complaints about choosing the wrong CMS. Those of you who are on the call who are vendors, I was not feeling the love for you. There were so many complaints, and I won't pick on any particular vendor because it was sort of across the board. It was, our vendor told us it could do X and it couldn't, or our vendor told us it could do X, but we discovered we actually needed Y, and nobody discovered that until it was too late. Our CMS did A, B, C, D, E, F, G really well, but we needed X, Y, and Z. Those kinds of complaints. Lots and lots of complaints about mismatches between what they were doing and the CMS. Also, a number of people who said in the past implementations that they were switching CMS vendors, that they were moving from one content management system to another post-adoption. So that was kind of interesting to see that people were saying, we are going to change that. So that was kind of, you know, just, I think, a surprise that they were in there talking about the wrong CMS. There's a question here, do I know the average size, number of writers and staff for the groups implementing DITA? I don't know yet. We do have that data, and we will get it, and we will make sure it's included in the final version of the report. But we did ask the question of how big the groups are. I just have not looked at that data yet. As you may be able to tell, we're close, but we're not quite done yet with this thing. We asked people about the biggest surprise. You know, what was the biggest surprise you encountered in implementation thus far, or in the past implementation? More complaints about tools. You know, immaturity of products, lack of incitement and initiative, lack of enthusiasm. Somebody said their major reduction in translation costs was a surprise. That surprised me because that's one of the things that people use as a justification. So I thought that was a little strange. But these people were saying we were surprised by the lack of excitement, the lack of enthusiasm, the lack of various things. One author never understood topics, said one person. And then we had these two, which I'll put side by side. One person said productivity increased by something like threefold, 800 pages to 3,200 pages per writer per year. A second person said productivity has been reduced by an average of 40%. Now, it's going to be interesting to figure out what the difference is between those two implementations, and I'm going to dig into that and see. But of course, I can't really take one response and compare it to another response and draw anything particularly profound out of it. So there's kind of an issue there. But there were clearly issues there. So a couple of comments on the vendor issues. One person saying that TechCom usually does not have much to say about CMS selection. IT frequently drives the selection. This is true, and it is a bad thing. You should not allow IT to drive your selection if you can avoid it, because IT will pick things that make them happy, and they will not pick things that will help TechCom. I'm dealing with this with a couple of clients right now where the enterprise standard is something that is not an appropriate thing to manage DITA content in, and they're moving to DITA content, and where are we going to put it? Another comment here, and this is an awesome one. I thought I picked the worst vendor until I talked with others at a local STC event. So apparently this is one of those nobody is happy kind of scenarios. Here's a happier one. I like this comment. This was good. So somebody said, well, you know, people have responded positively and they're happy with what we've done. and we didn't expect them to notice, but they did. So we'll kind of stop on that slide and have a nice warm fuzzy after all of this really depressing information that I'm throwing at you. The themes that we're seeing in the comments that are coming back, in the how did this work for you and how happy are you or how happy are you not, are tool issues, lack of maturity, functionality problems, difficult to use, and also change resistance, increasing change resistance, I think, but at the same time also increased interest. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. We had really a split between the people who said change resistance was a huge problem and the people who said, oh, we had no problems whatsoever, it was great. You know, everybody wanted to do it and they were excited and they were interested and whatever. So that was, you know, clearly when you have change resistance, it's a bad thing, but that was not a universal problem. That was just something that kind of came in. Okay, so at this point, I am going to start taking some questions. I've got a couple of final slides to show you with just contact information and stuff like that. But please go ahead and start flinging in your questions, and we will take those for the remainder of our time. So with that, I will go ahead and see what kind of questions are coming in. Comment on lack of enthusiasm. This indicates a lack of evangelism in the organization. Change needs evangelism. Didn't have a good salesperson. Yeah, that is absolutely true. It just doesn't help the people that are there at that point. So there's a question here about what is a good source for more info on DITA? There's a bunch of stuff on our website. There is dita.xml.org. There is, I'll let some other people jump in with that, and as the questions come in, if you have good sources of DITA information, go ahead and type them in, and I will post them out publicly to the various, to the questions tab and let people answer that question that way. Lack of maturity of tools, mostly related to CMSs or to DITA and structured writing tools. I saw complaints across the board. People were complaining about their tools, and I could probably produce a comment that complained about every single specific tool that is out there. Somebody did not like every single specific tool that was out there. And I do believe that there were complaints about the authoring tools. I remember one comment in particular that said it's really hard to do things in the DITA tools that are easy to do in the help authoring tools. And that person specifically mentioned indexing and custom ruling and shading, and a third thing that escapes me at the moment. So yes, there were complaints across the board. Okay, let's see, questions. This is more of a comment. I wonder how many structured authors are now feeling that the benefits, in quotes, of separating content from form are not as obvious as the buzz would have it. I would say to that the benefits of separating content from form are not benefits to the authors. They never have been. The benefit from structure goes to the organization because they get more reuse, they get better localization, they get various other things. But from an authoring point of view, it is not going to improve your life, no. And anybody that says it will, don't think so. Did any group say that structured authoring assisted writing in understanding what should be documented and how, rather than viewing it as a constriction or a standard? I have heard that before from other people. I have not heard it in the survey, but it was not a question that we asked in the survey specifically. Yes, somebody mentioned the Yahoo DITA users group. That would be a good place to go. There was a question about industry. I cannot give you an industry breakdown. I will go back and look at it, but I don't think we have good enough demographics. Providing company name or even industry was voluntary, and most people didn't do it. Is it possible to see our raw data? No. Sorry. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The big one is that we cannot give you the raw comments because people did identify themselves, and they identified their organizations, and absolutely not. The report, however, does have the raw data in the sense that it will give you the numbers that we got, in terms of the responses where there were multiple choice questions. And we've pulled out a lot of the quotes, but we really have to sanitize those. We have to take out the company names and make sure that people don't identify themselves. When they start saying things like, well, I work at a company that, and now I'm making things up, so don't go tracking them down. But when they say, oh, I work for a medical device company in this location, that makes it perhaps possible to track them down. And so we really, really can't go there. Yeah, there's a comment here. Disappointed on negativity on responses. Migration to DITA has been long and painful, but we can now, do value-added things. I'm not that surprised. It's been, it's been an issue all along. If localization is not a cost factor, how do you evangelize the other factors? Well, I would look at reuse, because if you can get increased reuse, you can show cost savings there. I would point you to the session on DITA ROI that I'm doing at STC, and there's also a recorded version of it already available on our website. I will send that out with the link that we will send you that has the recording on it. Is simplified DITA structure done? That's not a simple question. Let me get back to you on that one. The short answer is that yes, there are some options. But there are some issues with some of the options that are out there. I will send you a more detailed response on that. Any info on use of structured authoring with Agile? I'm going to throw that out to the group. Does anybody have any info on structured authoring with Agile? I am hearing about it, but I don't have anything useful. And with that, we're going to go ahead and cut off the recording.